we're finishing up all of our episodes with a book report now. Um, so so the book of this week is The Deficit Myth, which just came out. And I don't know if you've heard of Stephanie Kelton, Eric.
I have not. I'm not
Okay.
familiar with her.
Stephanie Kelton was Bernie Sanders' chief economic advisor, and she was, um, how do I put it? She also advised the Senate Democrats on on economic issues, and she is a proponent of an economic theory called modern monetary theory, which I think is has a it's very interesting because there we've talked a lot about some certain disconnects between what the experts say and what we're observing, and the fact that economic theory hasn't in many cases quite caught up with economic reality. And there are some shortcomings with this book to be sure, but I think it was some of her insights were really interesting. Let me cue up a few of these quotations because I think it's kind of surprising the overlap that we see between the left and the right. As much as we talk about the disagreements, but the overlap is perhaps even more interesting. If you could bring up the first quote, so here's the thing that she's mostly arguing against, which was the idea that deficits are evidence of overspending. So she's kind of making fun of Senator Enzi, who was a business owner from, I believe it's either Wyoming or Montana. He was a shoe salesman, and she just couldn't believe that he thought that the reason why we have deficits is because we spend too much. It seems like that's pretty self-evident, uh, but well, I'd ask you, where do you think she's going with this? Just the title of the book, the deficit myth. I think it kind of clues you in that she thinks that the idea that overspending is dangerous is something of a myth.
Well, there's a lot of people that think that on both sides of the aisle. That's probably one of the most nonpartisan issues there is. That's why I argue that nonpartisanism is not always a good thing, because both parties agree that we should spend ourselves into oblivion.
Right. Well, yeah, Dick Cheney was the one who said deficits don't matter. So if this guy Enzi is from Wyoming, and I think he is, they both be from the same state, but be on completely different issues of this. So if you could cue up the next thing. Now, this was the thing that I thought was really interesting. Now, you and I have talked about how the left wing Economic Policy Institute, the EPI, has that amazing chart of how productivity and wages have diverged, and she sort of ties together why that is. Since about 1971, 72, 73 is when that divergence started. It became really obvious or really apparent in 1973. Um, what she blames it on here is essentially that when uh, unemployment unemployment goes up, they start hiking rates in order to keep inflation at bay, as she says. And that term Nairu is like the level of like the minimum. Think of it as like the minimum amount of unemployment you can have before you have inflation. Now, what's that?
No, I didn't say anything.
Oh, okay. I thought it sounded like you had something to say there. Yeah, but I think that's an interesting idea, and this is kind of the key of like the Bernie Sanders crowd's economic thinking. That until you start seeing inflation, you haven't spent enough. That's that's I mean the key thesis, the core thesis of this book. Um,
Well, we've argued on this, or I've argued for this on this program, that inflation isn't exactly what people think it is, or it's not
mhm.
what they're telling us it is. I think of that line from The Princess Bride, which is the film that I enjoyed a lot as a kid. I've watched it many times, and there's this famous line: "I don't think that word means what you think it means." I
Right.
feel like that's what inflation has become, because we've talked about this before in terms of there are so many things like the cost of a house. Here, we'll just take that as an example, right? The cost of a house. And when you compare that to the level of people's incomes today as to what they were, say, 40, 50 years ago, It just there's no comparison. It was much easier to buy a house back then, even though we're told that we don't have massive inflation. Think of healthcare. That's a great one, and that's one where the standards people are kind of they're obviously talking out of both ends of their mouth. You're telling me there's no inflation in healthcare compared to say 40, 50 years ago when most people didn't have health insurance, but they would just go to the local doctor and just pay them? And you're saying there's no inflation in healthcare? I recently had to go to the ER, and I recently got my bill, and I have insurance, and my bill was substantial, but you should see the charges that they had on there. And I went in there for a simple procedure because I needed stitches. So I'm just telling you, that's not inflation. Of course it's inflation, because what it means is that your money power is going down. But it doesn't affect everything, because, for instance, we can talk about manufacturing. And manufacturing tends to keep going down, 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 down. Why? Because of automation. Eventually, manufacturing is going to cost almost nothing, because you're not going to need hardly even a single human being to be involved with the process. Once you get that manufacturing plant up, you're talking about pennies for some of these items. It's just the cost of materials. The cost of
Right.
labor is always the most expensive. So we kind of have these different things happening at the same time. So I can go and buy really cheap stuff at Walmart, and I think that my money power is pretty good. And in that respect, it is, because I can buy a lot of stuff. I can go to Walmart. I can go to the dollar store. I can almost buy the entire store, and get a lot of actually pretty good products, because I go to the dollar store all the time, and you can actually get some pretty good stuff there, and it's $1. But that's because the cost of manufacturing keeps going down. But if I want to buy a new house, you know what I mean? Depending on what my lifestyle is, that might be a tricky position with my current income. And that's
Right.
why it's sort of inflation, I think, doesn't mean the same things to everyone, and we don't put it across the board. As far as, it's not just all one thing anymore. It's not just that
Yeah.
number they tell us it is. It's reflected in other things.
Yeah. Yeah, inflation. I think it's certainly not even anymore. I'm not sure that it ever was evenly distributed. If you could bring up the next quote, here's where I think it gets really interesting when it says she talks about President Nixon's decision to suspend dollar convertibility increased money sovereignty to the United States, forever changing the nature of the relative constraint on federal spending. Under the Bretton Woods system, the federal budget had to be fairly tightly controlled to protect the nation's gold reserves. Now, what does that mean? In 1971, about the time that wages diverged from productivity, was when we went off the gold standard. Now, you and I made this observation, and that's kind of where I was going with this. That she looks at that and says, okay, since 1971, the Federal Reserve has been able to preempt inflation by raising rates. And what happens is every time wages start to go up, they raise rates, which crushes wages back down. Oftentimes, it'll cause us to go into a little bit of a recession. Um, and so there are a couple of lessons we can learn from that. One would be, well, we need to have stable money. We need to get the Fed out of interest rates and allow the free market to do its magic, so to speak. But the lesson that she takes is exactly the opposite. Yes, we should get rid of the Federal Reserve because it's being used to constrain wages and by extension inflation. Uh, but that this was a good thing that we got away from the gold standard, and so now we should let Congress basically decide how much money there is. Forget monetary policy, forget interest rates. If we don't have enough inflation, or if we have too much unemployment, just turn on the spigots. And if you ask her why this wouldn't create massive inflation, even though by definition it is inflation to create more money like this, printing money is inflation. And she, again, she would quibble with that definition there. Um, but in essence, her response is, this isn't taking resources out of circulation. This is taking resources that are on the side, people who are unemployed, and putting them back into the workforce, taking resources that are going fallow, not being used, and putting them to use. What do you think about that, Eric?
Well, we've talked about this before too. A story that I've told you many times, but some of our listeners may not have heard before. is that back in the days of the Arizona Liberty Caucus, I would attend political rallies and I would film them. And I went to a Bernie Sanders rally to film his rally, and I wore an End the Fed shirt. And I got a lot of compliments on my End the Fed shirt. But the problem is, so oftentimes, and I see this with libertarians, especially big L libertarians, all the time. They'll take an issue like, for instance, police reform. That's very topical right now. And they'll think, oh, wow, this is awesome. There's all these lefties that are supporting my view now. And I'm getting great hits on my Twitter, and this is awesome. And they're totally with me in police reform. Guys, they don't think of police reform the same way you do. And this is the same thing with what we're talking about right now. And the Fed doesn't mean the same thing to a lot. I'm not going to say all, but to a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters and to Bernie Sanders himself, as evident in this book. It doesn't mean the same thing as it means to Ron Paul and to our side. It means different things. They have different agendas, different goals than the rest of us. And so we think that there's sort of a commonality. Hey, we have a common cause. We both want to audit the Fed. Well, they want to audit the Fed for very different reasons than why we want to audit the Fed. And I think we fall into this trap all the time because there's a certain naivete when it comes to people on our side, people that advocate for liberty. Like I said, especially I see it with big L libertarians all the time, that they don't quite understand that philosophically they're coming from a very different place. They think because, quote unquote, the end goal is the same. Guys, that's not the end goal. They're just getting started. That's our end goal. We just want to go there. We don't want to go any further than that. No, they have another agenda after that. After they get rid of the Fed, they're going to replace it. Guess what? After they get rid of the police, they're going to replace it, folks. That's the bottom line. So that's not their end goal. That's my point. They have another reason. They have another agenda beyond that.
Right. Yeah. So her position is not that we should end the Fed and go back to commodity money, go back to say the gold standard. She's very uh, vociferous in opposing that kind of thing. She believes that it was great that we got away from the gold standard, that it unshackled us, that it freed us to explore different policy options. And in a certain sense, I think I think it's factually true. The menu of policy options that we have, whether they're good or bad, for better or for worse, have expanded. Um, but 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 really, what she's talking about is politicizing the powers that the Federal Reserve currently has, taking them away from the Federal Reserve and giving them largely to Congress, getting away from monetary policy as the way that we prime the pump, that we try to stimulate the economy during a recession, and going to fiscal stimulus, meaning that we simply spend a lot of money put directly in people's hands. So it's not even it's almost not even a matter of will inflation happen. It's almost like by definition inflation.
Like
Whereas when the federal was that
you're hitting the nail on the head. So you're basically just reshuffling the deck. It's not like our side that says, hey, nobody should have this power. She's just
Mhm.
saying, let's put the power in somebody else's hands. That's just
Right.
reshuffling the deck. So you're not changing anything. You're just changing who ultimately makes the call, right? Now would I
Mhm.
argue that perhaps it makes more sense for Congress to have that power since that's kind of what Congress is supposed to do? I don't know, maybe, but my argument is more along the lines of nobody should have this power. This is an overreach. This is tyranny. We shouldn't be doing this to begin with. Shuffling the deck and putting it into somebody else's hands, that's kind of like the old argument that, oh, if only Hitler was a good guy, and then he could have accomplished so many good things. No, there's that argument. It's actually from a Star Trek episode. There's that
Oh,
argument.
okay.
If only Hitler was a good man, he could have used that system because he did do good things. For instance, Nazi Germany had 100% employment far before the United States did. There were things that he did that were efficient and that were quote unquote good. And the argument is, well, if Hitler had been a better person, that would have worked better. That system would have worked better. The problem is the system itself was inherently corrupt. Power corrupts. That's the problem.
Right.
So when you shuffle the deck, you're not changing anything. That's my point.
Yeah. I see your point now. It doesn't matter who has the power. It's the fact that they have that kind of power that attracts those sorts of leaders in the first place. Um, yeah, we see the violence inherent in the system. Could you cue up the next quotation here? Now, here's where this is what I thought was really interesting. This is something that some Tea Party leaders even took a bit of an interest in. Not this whole thing, but during the 2008 crisis, she urged the Obama administration to enact a robust stimulus, meaning spend a lot of money, print money, hand it out, throw it out of a helicopter, uh, calling for a payroll tax holiday, which I think Trump and the Republican Congress have called for as well. I don't know. I don't think they've passed that into law, but that's certainly a proposal that has been bandied about, that we get rid of the payroll tax, at least temporarily. Um, because the people being hit hardest, of course, are the people who are living paycheck to paycheck. So a regressive tax like that would make sense to suspend, perhaps. But okay, um, she wants additional aid for state and local governments. You can kind of understand, because state and local governments cannot print money in the way the federal government can have. And the final one I think is really interesting is the federal job guarantee. Now, I don't know about the federal part, but think about in practical terms what a job guarantee is. That right now, if somebody's out of work, they go on unemployment or they go on welfare. And which she's advocating essentially is that, imagine if a condition of going on welfare, if you're an able bodied person, is that you have to, work at the state park or the national park, or whatever, you're painting a wall or something. You are you are returning some value to society in exchange for receiving those benefits. What do you think about that as an idea?
Well, on the surface of it, I'm not opposed to it. I like the idea of people that are on welfare actually doing something. I think that concept actually, um, it's sort of better than what we have now. Um, just the basic concept on it, on its face, I think is interesting. Uh, but then again, I'm someone that's not a big advocate for welfare to begin with. So it's kind of like, am I going to get bait, get baited and switched, that kind of a thing?
Right.
Because again, like I mentioned before, I think their end goal is very different than mine. I don't want
Mhm.
anybody to be on welfare. That's the bottom line. I understand that
Yeah.
there are situations where they need it. I'm also a federalist and think that that's something the state should be taking care of if they decide to, and if the people of that state
Mhm.
decide to, rather than the federal government being the primary engine of that. And I do understand you were touching upon the fact that obviously the federal government can print money, the states can't, and that's kind of why the system is the way it is right now. But as
Mhm.
a constitutionalist and a federalist, I would argue that it's the state's obligation or the state's decision, amongst the people to decide whether they want to do welfare. I don't think it should
Right.
be in the federal government's hands to begin with. But I do
Mhm.
like the idea that if we're going to have some sort of welfare program, that you would have to do something to earn it. That you couldn't just sit at home and watch TV and get your welfare check.
Right. Yeah, and the other thing that's really interesting is it's not just. I mean, obviously she's coming in from a leftist perspective. So again, hitting that topic of here's an interesting point of intersection, but we're coming at it from completely different directions. She's looking at it less from the perspective of it's a matter of justice. You shouldn't be sitting at home, but which is kind of the more people on the right might look at it that way. But from the perspective of if somebody is out of work for 3 months or 6 months or a year and they're collecting welfare in the meantime, it gets harder and harder the longer they're out of work to get back into the labor force, because a potential employer will say, "Hey, you haven't worked in 6 months. What's the deal? What's the problem? Don't you show up to work?" That kind of thing. And so her thinking is that this would reduce structural unemployment, because those people who can work, but through for whatever reason they get sick or they just can't find a job for 3 months, they don't end up staying out of the labor market, the private labor market, longer than they have to, simply because they no longer have a track record of work. They don't have any references to fall back on. um, and so that kind of gets to kind of tying her whole theory together, which is that the reason why she believes in all this stimulus is to make sure that resources, especially human resources, that are on the sidelines, that they're in the marketplace. They're not outside of the marketplace. We don't have all this potential that's being wasted, because human life is finite. These working years, if they're gone, they're gone. Um, yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the major problems with welfare, as we see it in its current manifestation, and of course it's changed over time. Bill Clinton did some actual major welfare reform during his administration, but it's kind of interesting if you listen to stories or if you know some people that have been on welfare or needed it. It's interesting to hear their stories. Like I had a friend who basically was a single mother, and during her the early parts of the infancy of her child, she got hurt. She had no other means of support, and she applied for welfare and basically was denied on the grounds that eventually she would be healthy again and be able to go back to work. But what does that tell you? That tells you that they don't want you to go back to work. They want you to perpetually be part of the welfare state and not support yourself and basically be beholden to the state for the rest of your life. And there are clearly bureaucrats and clearly policies out there that push that push that. That's just one story.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happens is a lot of times you can kind of see that welfare becomes about dependency, and it's not really about that helping hand to lift somebody up, which is the way that it's been kind of sold to us. With
Hmm.
LBJ's Great Society, that's how it was sold to us. Hey, we're just giving these people an extra hand, lifting them up. So because sometimes right now is a great example. There are circumstances beyond people's control. In my own neighborhood right now, there are many bars that are closed, and that means that those servers and bartenders cannot work. They cannot go to work
Hmm.
right now. So should they have some sort of access to welfare, especially when it's the government that basically shut down their business to begin with? I could advocate for that, but it's a temporary solution to eventually get them back to work. I think the problem is with welfare so often is there's no real push to get people back to work. They just want them perpetually to be in that dependent state for the rest of their lives.
Right. Well, yeah, I don't disagree with that. Oftentimes it's kind of like the private prisons dilemma, where if you incentivize people who own a business to increase the prison population, they have less of an incentive to rehabilitate the prisoners who are in their private prisons. But there was one other thing, and I don't have the quote up here, but it was kind of a doomsday prediction that, in fact, I'll just throw up. I have a picture of the Economist here, so you can see who we're talking about. Stephanie Kelton. She is, yeah, that is Bernie Sanders' advisor. She's a professor at Stony Brook College. But there was one real doomsday prediction in this book that I thought was really interesting, and that was, it doesn't matter if we privatize Social Security, in essence, is what she's saying. That if we do, and let's say you save 20% of your income every month, and at the end of 30, 40 years of doing that, you have enough in theory to retire on, you're set for life. What happens if there simply aren't enough working people and enough resources to support the retirees? Because the it's not like the food you produce during your working years, that's not there anymore.
This
Anything
is not
you
this is not a theoretical problem, by the way. Uh, this is what's also known sometimes as the demographic time bomb. Places like
Yeah.
Western Europe and Japan, they're looking at this as a real reality because when you have an aging population and you're not replacing your people at a certain rate, hey, this is one of those examples where the numbers really don't lie. Eventually, it's not going to be the fact that your one child is working for both parents. No, it's your one child working for both parents and four grandparents.
Hmm.
That's the kind of math we're looking at. That's one of the problems even in China. They have a demographic time bomb because of their one child policy, because that's exactly one of the big examples of this potential crisis. But Japan, their numbers look awful when it comes to this. In fact, I'll tell you, you know what their solution is, by the way, right? Do you know what Japan's solution is to that?
Is it euthanasia?
Wow. Hey, Japan's a democracy. Come on, Pete. No, their solution is technology. They want to build robots.
Oh,
That's
okay.
why you see. That's why Japan is at the forefront of humanoid robot development. Is because they plan to use robots to care for their elderly. That's their only solution
uh,
because they're not making enough Japanese. So,
right.
which is really sad.
No, yeah, I don't necessarily mean forced euthanasia, but I wouldn't be surprised anytime you have socialized medicine, there's a great incentive for to push people towards euthanasia for the so-called greater good that that occurs sometimes. I mean, that occurs to some extent even in our society. But I wasn't being facetious about that. But yeah, I think technology can be a solution, and she does talk about that being at least a partial solution to the problem. But I think it is an interesting question. It doesn't matter how many dollars we have saved up when we retire. It does matter about the resources, and if there's not enough resources, then that could, as you called it, a demographic time bomb. And what we'll see in that case will essentially be inflation, one way or another, as we scramble to bid up uh, the price of scarce resources.
Yeah, I can totally see that. That absolutely makes sense to me, because you can imagine someone who actually saved rather well, and say they have $500,000, they have $500,000, which sounds great. But if the cost of getting into a nursing home, for instance, is $100,000 a month, well, I guess you got 5 months to live, right?
Right. Yeah. So on that cheerful note, I do recommend you read the book because it is a different perspective. They do talk about inflation in quite a bit of detail, and they talk about different theories. And I think we have reached a point where we need to start exploring, the whole socialism capitalism thing. Socialism is dead. Marxism died. She is not a Marxist. She may be in favor of wild spending, but she is and nowhere says that we should get rid of money. We should get rid of markets as Marx intended. Um, and the fact that we haven't seen inflation, that our current theories of inflation seem to be deficient, I think means that whether she's right or wrong, the fact that she's courageous enough, she and Warren Mosler and Randall Wray are courageous enough to advance different theories is very necessary at this time because we can all see the ticking time bomb here on some of these issues, and we don't really have answers. So anyway, yeah, it's a good read. It just came out this month. A lot of people are talking about it, and it's a very approachable read. Believe it or not, it's if you've read any of Milton Friedman's stuff, it's kind of on that level, like capitalism and freedom. So it's certainly a very readable book. And with that, I would say I'm Pete Maines. This is my co-host Eric Alexander, and until next week, you keep flying free.